First, this will reduce average people's access to loans and credit, which is bad for economic growth and people's ability to live prosperously. Secondly, that assuming the negative team will make an argument that this reduces the risk of high-risk assets. That risk is tolerable. We will happily weigh it off and say it's less concerning than argument one. And thirdly, I'll explain an attempt at a flip of this impact that they will attempt to make, which explains that this means that certain assets, and securities, have low liquidity, which will worsen financial market risks. First, let's talk about access to credit. I think this is cleanly where the affirmative team can win the debate. The Dodd-Frank laws that were passed after the global financial crisis as an attempt at financial market regulation have, empirically, which imposed rules like this one, increased mortgage interest rates enormously as a result of that requirement. And I think the mechanism for that is extraordinarily easy to see. When you're exposed to a risk of default, that you're now through these instrumental rules that we're opposing, forced to hold on to and to consider in your decision making, you are, as a person who lends, far less likely to just hold that yourself like, well, it's fine. You're far more likely to pass that on to the consumers of the financial instruments that you are creating. So what that looks like in the real world is you are far more constrictive about who you lend to because of the risk that you are now taking on. You're far more intense about the requirements that you place on the people that you lend to, again, because of the risk that you're taking on. So that means that the loan that you give someone has a higher interest rate. And if they're like, oh, that's a loan and a security, well, securities are based on the underlying assets, or that's how this happens, right? So what that means is far fewer people get credit, and the credit that they get is more onerous to obtain, which means fewer want to get it. And the harms of that, I think, are pretty enormous. Access to credit, access to loans, access to money is good for economic growth in a wealth of fairly intuitive ways. It means that businesses are able to start. It means that businesses are able to trust the financial environment so that they can expand and hire more people and create more good services that people like. But also, I would suggest that they are pretty pro-innovation. So that means that in environments where there are low interest rates, sectors that require intense capital in order to translate into a return tend to do really well. So an example of this is green energy. Green energy requires a lot of investment in order for it to be profitable, requires a lot of technology, requires a lot of research, and that money doesn't immediately translate into the desirable result of a transition away from fossil fuels, but it is something that is tremendously socially desirable. And when it is more easy and better when you're better able to obtain the credit to make those kinds of investment, then those innovations in the economy become far more likely. The final thing that I think is a benefit of this is just when interest rates are really high, as these kind of rules make banks do, this leads to a harm to international borrowing. So a lot of loans are denominated in US dollars. So if interest rates that are denominated in US dollars become higher, people who have far less financial mobility, for instance in the developing world, who have their instruments denominated in US dollars are disproportionately impacted by those, which is damaging. Now, I assume the response that the negative team will make to this is, all of this is worthwhile because these requirements mean that the financial system becomes far less risky and we should prioritize that above all else. The first thing I want to explain here is that I just don't think that systemic risk, especially in a post-GFC environment, is really one that you all prioritize very highly in this debate, for a couple of reasons. The first is that there are huge professional and reputational costs to people who operate in this sector for behaving badly. Like, often people make moral hazard arguments in debates that are like, well, when you don't regulate people, they tend to behave badly. But I think that's a bit fake, because if you're a banker that behaves badly, that causes risk, that causes you a bank run, that causes, it's like, you do it, even if it means that your bank attracts more regulation than it otherwise would because of your poor behavior, that means you very often get fired and or unable to be employed ever again in that sector. All which creates an enormous natural incentive for systemic risk to be unlikely. But I would suggest, that's quite a generic mechanism. The global financial crisis, which happened and was an instance of systemic risk, enormously bears on this debate for a couple of reasons. The first is that fear of regulation by banks that were imposed as a result of the GFC means that banks fear regulation a lot, and they are preemptively less risky in the practices that they take. But secondly, there is much greater public understanding of the risks that people take on when they do, for instance, buy a high-risk security, which means that the kinds of people who opt into it now are far better equipped to make decisions about whether or not it's good for them. But thirdly, we have increased and introduced a bunch of reserve requirements on banks, so the GFC's problem was one of being able to respond to things going wrong, and now we have reserve requirements that fix that problem when it does happen. So systemic risk is really not the boogeyman that the negative team are going to try and make it out to be in this debate. But even if it were something that was worth considering, it would suggest systemic risk affects a set of people who are able to stomach harm. So the kinds of people who are most harmed when banks, for instance, become risky and volatile are the kinds of people who do high-frequency trading of things like stocks and bonds. They are people who have the ability to sponge those losses because they have assets of underlying value outside of that system. Compare this, for instance, to the things we're talking about in our first argument. Growth that impacts businesses that employ average people, things that impact the entire economy, like the ability of green energy to be profitable. These kinds of things, just in terms of scale of who they impact and how they impact them matter more. But they also affect a stakeholder or person who is much more sympathetic to try and protect within the financial system. Let's then talk about our assets. I think that this actually would worsen financial risk in the market because it would mean certain assets have low liquidity in a way they otherwise wouldn't. Because it means banks are less incentivized to create large amounts of things to give out to people because they become riskier. See the proof of this in our first argument. But also now they have to hold some of it, so like the market itself has less access to that asset than it otherwise would. So in the Dodd-Frank rules, it's like 5 or 10%. So that's 5 or 10% less liquidity for that asset. In addition to, for instance, the amount that they're not lending out because they're preemptively fearful of the rule. And the harms of this, I think, are actually pretty enormous. The first, and I think most intuitive of which, is that market panic tends to spread. When you trust that when you want to sell that asset, when you fear that it's going to lose value, you are far more quick to sell that asset now than you otherwise would be if there was lots of it available, because now you're fearful that you just won't be able to find a buyer because there's not that many people who hold that asset. You feel that there's not many people who would necessarily want that asset, which reduces the threshold to markets panicking in a way that is really bad. What happens when financial markets panic is things like bank runs, where there is a reduced, now in their words, reduced capacity now for banks to get around distressed assets and in a panicked market, all of which means that banks start to lose solvency because people pull all their money out of them. Now banks have no ability to pay down their debts, to return money when people want to withdraw them, and that is enormously harmful because it's really, really bad for people to lose all the money they deposited in a bank. But less extremely, I think that means that there's huge decreases and dips in value when stocks and assets are volatile that this promotes, for instance, like pension funds reducing in value. And the final thing I would say here is specific to the mechanism of liquidity is it reduces allocative efficiency. So, it's good when stocks that represent businesses that are doing good things get capital. It's bad when the reverse is true. But if it becomes harder to sell an asset, to sell an asset that's bad and to buy assets that are good because there's less of them in the market, that reduces the ability of the market to price things accurately, all which means business prices are inaccurate. For that reason, project.
I'm going to explain why this improves retail investment, then I'm going to explain why systemic risk is actually quite a big consideration, undercutting all the material that Oscar brings you, but firstly on setup. Firstly, who is likely to buy these securities? I think the largest proportion of these investors are retail investors. Mom and dads who are putting away 10% of their income so that they can engage in securities so that they can build up an investment portfolio. Note that brokerage is quite hard, so they often rely on institutional investors, like going to a combank brokerage so they can set up your investment portfolio and they can essentially advise you on all of those risks and do all of the work for you. And then obviously it is some of the big investors that they talk about on site Affirmative. But obviously this is not the largest portion of the market. The largest portion of the investment market is retail investors. They are the people that we should care most about in this debate. But secondly, what does this market look like? Obviously, I think, despite the analysis we get from Oscar, this market is actually quite poorly regulated. Even post-GFC, it is really easy to skirt disclosure rules. Note that the structural reason for this are twofold. The first is that banks have a lot of structural power, so they can hold this information from consumers in a way that is quite pernicious. But secondly, the way that risk is often communicated is through conversations that are quite hard to understand if you don't have a lot of financial literacy, or through 50-page PDSs that people don't read, even at the top levels of financial literacy. But thirdly, why does this regulate? What does this regulation look like that we support? Firstly, it's either the purchase or retention of a percentage of the securities that they sell. So it's something like purchasing on top of that initial 10% of the securities they sell. But I will just note here secondly that it is obviously on top of the investment. It is not a fee that they take out of the investment, so that doesn't deduct from the individual investor's portfolio. But thirdly, obviously, we think that we can just, that this would be policed quite well by like the SEC or the ASIC. Firstly, because this is quite simple to do, and secondly, because obviously the government has soft incentives to do this well. I think this then deals with a lot of the material that we get about why banks weren't likely to engage in moral hazards or exploit individuals. Because the only analysis that we get is that banks will be deleted because obviously they fear a whole lot of regulation. This flies in the face of two things. The first is that banks are too big to fail at the moment, which means that being slapped by a $100 million fine from the SEC or ASIC is literally pennies on their profit. They don't care about that. But they're not, however, secondly, too big to fail from the risk that they take on from securing and collateralizing the securities that we would require them to do in the risk retention regulations that we're promoting. Because obviously these are significant amounts of their commercial and retail investment they now have to secure that obviously exposes them to risk that means that they want to hedge away from risky investments, that means that they want to diversify their portfolio to assuage people and the economy from systemic risk. We actually think this creates more panic than the material that Oski was used for why panic would be worse on our side. Okay, the only push on this, the only constructive path to victory that we get from this affirmative team is that it is harder to access credit. I'm going to defeat this now. They explain that this is secured by underlying securities. Okay, sure, but obviously there is just so much money above the mandated reserve levels that banks are required to have, they can just dish out. So it's unclear why exactly this changes the borrowing calculus of something like the Commonwealth Bank. They literally have billions and trillions of dollars above their reserves that they can hand out, that they can lend to consumers. Obviously, this still happens symmetrically. But the second thing is obviously, empirically, borrowing is just higher than pre-GFC levels in real terms. This was just an assertion that gets no structural analysis except to say that there were a series of regulations post-GFC that meant that interest rates go up. Even though interest rates are higher, there are a series of reasons that actually banks do engage in more loaning. There were three of these. Firstly, obviously it was profitable to loan money. This was the primary way in which banks made their money, so obviously they wanted to engage a lot of this thing. That was how they made their money. But secondly, obviously the risk of credit doesn't really change on either side of this world, because the risk, the money isn't secured by an underlying security as they try to explain to you. It's actually secured by the pool of credit that the bank has. And sure, that decreases, but obviously the credit risk of the individual consumer hasn't changed because of this legislation. But thirdly, obviously firms that innovate that they wanted to talk about, like green firms, want to innovate on both sides. So these are the most risk tolerant, the people who are most tolerant to high interest rates, because they exist on a higher risk, higher reward calculus. That means that they can actually make money, so they can engage in this kind of behavior. Note that they're likely to do this. They're backed by venture capitalists who front these things, who collateralize their funds that mean that they can access this credit symmetrically. Okay, why does this improve retail investment? The way that I'll get at the top of this is twofold. The first is that obviously this is the largest group of people that are affected by this policy, noting that that makes them probably the most important group, but they're also the most vulnerable, because firstly they lack structural power, as I explained, secondly they lack capital, and thirdly they lack financial literacy. Okay, why are these securities primarily purchased by retail investors? Firstly, often they are they are made by retail banks, i.e. Combank, Barclays, HSBC are the primary ones who are creating these securities and trading them, rather than institutional banks that are dealing with big firms, as they try to tell you and just assert. But secondly, obviously larger funds create their own securities, which suggests to you that asset management funds want to do this anyway. They're likely to do this in either world. But thirdly, asset management firms already do this because they seek to profit. So the way in which they do this is often retaining a percentage of the portion of the securities they sell, or purchasing a percentage on top of that so that they can profit. Three mechanisms here. Firstly, as to why it's better for retail investors. Firstly, it hedges against the worst risks that they talk about, because obviously banks take on some of this risk, which means that they can't pass on all of the risk to consumers. Obviously, that means that when people are playing with other people's money, it means that they make risks that they otherwise wouldn't make. We think the risk calculus changes in a way that is quite good on our side. But secondly, increased consumer confidence, because brokerage is incredibly complicated. It makes it quite easy to trust the investment once you can tell the business people that you can trust the investment because the banks are also backing it. Note that thirdly, obviously this increases the likelihood of the bailout. And this is probably the most important mechanism under this cloud. Because obviously banks are quite big to fail. Governments can't let them fail. So when banks, like solvency is tied up in a lot of these securities, and banks' security is tied up in a lot of these securities, it means that governments are far more likely to bail out these banks. But they're also far more likely to bail out the securities themselves, like the S&P 500, or what we are going to explain are medium tier funds that they're likely to diversify out to. And that's quite good because it means that they hedge against the worst risk of these things failing. But fourthly, obviously people invest along the lines of these banks anyway, which means that this thing like portfolio tracking that is quite good. All of that results in better retail investment. The impact of this was twofold. Firstly, it prevents the collapse of portfolios for the average person, noting that the biggest stakeholder and the most vulnerable in this debate. But obviously, this meant that as well, there was a knock-on effect for like the financial crisis, which I'll explain in a second. Obviously, we just needed to outcompete inflation on our side and take a win because that was the way in which these investors were likely to get the win. Okay, let's just deal with systemic risk. And I think this is quite an important issue because obviously it determines how well economies can respond to situations of crises. They try to mitigate this by explaining it's actually not that important post-GFC. But obviously it's quite important. We just went through a financial crisis which was literally exacerbated by the fact that so much of our investment from institutional banks was directed into a very specific and particular set of funds. Obviously that meant that hedging away from this was quite good. Firstly, banks don't fully invest into the most secure securities on our side. It means that if they fail, the whole bank fails, and note that is quite a significant harm for them. That means that they push a whole lot of middle tier investments that are still relatively secure. It means that they go to these investments, these are the investments that they push, and it means that the market is more diversified away from a very small set of things, which decreases the amount of systemic risk in those particular firms failing. But secondly, obviously banks don't like risk, so when you don't do this risk retention, they are playing with other people's money, it changes their risk calculus in a way that is quite good. The impact of this is quite simple. It means that you can get out of financial crises quicker. Obviously this is speculative, but homogenous investment is literally what damages economies and makes it impossible to recover from financial crises for decades.
Okay. Two parts to the speech. Firstly, on average people and how this impacts them, and then secondly, on a broader level, how does this impact the market as a whole. Firstly, on average people. I'm going to start first by explaining the type of investor who invests in these specific asset classes created by banks by combining different kinds of assets into securities. The first thing I want to point out is that there is an empirical untruth in that first negative, which is that the largest investors are retail investors and therefore constitute the largest majority of this market. Super unintuitive claim. The largest investors in every market in the world, especially markets that have large pension funds, especially markets, even including the United States, which has a really large number of retail investors, are institutional investors. The reason being they have the highest access to capital. Many people who would become retail investors choose to invest their wealth via institutional investors, all of which suggests to you that the people who are interpreting the risk we're talking about are highly sophisticated investors who, even if banks explained it through 50-page confusing documents, would be able to interpret that and would be able to pass it well. That constitutes the vast majority of things. And I think that is OIV knowledge that you can interpret out of the fact. But secondly, I think there are a series of specific features of this kind of a security class that makes retail investors unlikely to hold it in large proportions. First is given to you by this team, that is brokerage fees are extremely high, which means the barrier for entering that market is quite significant. You need to purchase large quantities of that security class in order to make a significant return on it, and you probably need to be invested in a variety of different kinds of these security classes in order to return a profit in the long run, which means retail investors choose to opt into other kinds of asset classes that have lower brokerage fees. Secondly, they're very confusing, as this team points out, and retail investors who have less knowledge about markets are aware of that fact and choose to opt into markets they have a greater understanding of, because that's where their risk is most secure. As they point out, we're talking about if you're talking about mum and pop people who are investing 10% of their savings in this asset, they're unlikely to do that into an asset class that is more confusing rather than one they understand better. Thirdly, as they point out, these tend to be riskier than other kinds of security classes, which means retail investors who are less capable of handling that risk are far more likely to invest large proportions of their wealth into low-risk assets like bonds, into ETFs, into other things that are safer for their long-run financial planning, all of which would suggest to the vast majority of people who are invested into high-risk boutique security classes are not mum-and-pop retail investors, but institutional investors purchasing security classes made by banks in order to expose themselves to different kinds of sophisticated risk, unlike retail investors. Their next claim is, well, their attempt at proving this is to be like sophisticated investors don't want these kinds of security classes because they can create their own. But obviously you just can't create these kinds of security classes unless you have access to the underlying asset which constitutes the overall security. Like if you're purchasing a security, which is a combination of loans bundled together into one security which you then purchase, you can't do that unless you have access to large quantities of loans to bundle together into a security which you can sell. Which explains why they seek out banks in order to produce securities they wouldn't be able to produce on their own, to purchase and expose themselves to different kinds of sophisticated risk. That is a significant amount of mitigation to their case, because a lot of their case is like they have lots of structural power. They have the ability to not follow regulation. But all of that is also true of the sophisticated investors who hold recipient assets. So even if banks have large amounts of institutional power, it's also true of the people purchasing it, and they push back against that regulation. They lobby governments to ensure that regulation is enforced, because they want their security classes to be what is on the tin. They want to be able to expose themselves to specific kinds of risk they want, at the specific levels they want. And it also significantly mitigates the extent to which they can be misled, even in the absence of regulation, because their sophistication means that even if it is complicated or difficult to understand, those sophisticated investors are able to handle that kind of asset class. Setting that aside then, their claim is banks have low regulation even post-financial crisis because they're difficult to enforce. They have two mechanisms for this. The first is to say that risk is communicated in confusing ways over things like 50-page documents that are difficult to understand. I would point out, firstly, there are often discrete measures of risk that you can analyze, even if you don't want to analyze the more complicated component of the risk. For example, how volatile is that asset? What have historical price trades look like? But secondly, investors have, sellers of these security classes have an incentive to explain the level of risk clearly. Because, as I said, confusion is a deterrent from exposing yourself to a security, especially where that security is high risk, which is why they simplify how complicated it is to understand what level of risk you're doing when you're purchasing that asset. If it were true that banks made these securities so difficult to understand, those securities would never be purchased. Their next mechanism is that they have a lot of structural power, but no explanation of what that actually means. As I explained, the people purchasing the securities also have a lot of structural power, but clearly if on their side, governments have enough regulatory capacity to overcome that structural power and implement something like a credit whatever requirement, then they're also able to implement other kinds of things because they have sufficient structural power themselves to overcome banks, even if banks are particularly powerful. So that then I think mitigates the vast majority of the harms this team attempts to prove in the debate. Their attempt at mitigating our harm to average people is to say that high interest rates are actually good. Firstly, I point out they don't respond to our claim RE inequality, which is that lower interest rates overwhelmingly provide capital to people who do not currently have wealth. Those are people who desperately need money, who need housing, who need the ability to start businesses in their own communities, to create economic growth. It's people in the developing world, it's people who live in working class areas with working class families. Access to capital here is immensely beneficial, so even if it has harms to the overall wealth of highly sophisticated investors, I think we're willing to take that trade-off. Even if in the long run, this harms people who are going through and paying the brokerage fees of mum and pop people who are actually just upper middle class nonsense who invest in, that's the wrong word, but invest in really expensive brokerage produced asset classes. We prefer they be harmed than people who are investing or accessing credit on the whole. But secondly, their response to innovation just makes no sense. Innovators tend to borrow, not lend to cost of capital, people, whatever. This is something that I'm pretty sure was taken out of Ryan Lafferty's manifile. Just because you have the scarcity of wealth doesn't mean you increase the competition in terms of how much incentive you have to innovate. That incentive to innovate is pretty endogenous towards markets, and access to capital enables people to act on that endogenous incentive towards innovation. People always want to innovate in markets. Providing with capital is what creates that efficiency and creates the innovation. But thirdly, they also just have no response towards the effect of international lending. We explained that increasing interest rates on loans denominated in US dollars increases the interest rates on all of those loans around the world, which also increases has huge harms from the developing world. That should prove to you pretty conclusively this is bad people for the average person. Next, let's talk about the overall market. The first thing that I want to do here is just explain why it is really bad for banks to hold large quantities of high-risk securities, remembering that that is the key feature of this debate. Banks currently remove risk from their portfolios by selling it to investors that have a higher risk tolerance than themselves. This would force banks to hold larger quantities of high-risk assets. Why is that bad? Firstly, banks are really significantly integrated into financial markets and economies, so increasing their risk really significantly increases the risk of the economy as a whole. Firstly, they hold other people's assets. Secondly, they provide people with credit they need, and also determine the interest rates on existing loans, which flips their claim around the average person. But thirdly, banks play a really important role in easing financial crises because they facilitate people moving their assets from high high-risk assets into low-risk assets, noting that in a financial crisis, you can't rely on the secondary market to do that because those assets are in demand, which makes the secondary market much more expensive. The second reason then why it's bad is because this makes it harder for banks to handle and get through those crises. Firstly, because in a market crisis, if they're exposed to more risk, then in a crisis, they lose a much higher portion of their cash reserve, which means they're less able to handle people defaulting on their loans because they can't bail out those loans. Secondly, it also makes it much more expensive for central banks to provide them with relief. They point out this is difficult, but it's obviously possible in the status quo. When banks lose a much higher portion of their cash reserve, it's infinitely more expensive for central banks to bail out those banks and make sure that they continue able to keep the economy as a whole afloat. But thirdly, we also explain that banks play a really important role in people's everyday lives. Making them deal with the consequences of high risk makes them dysfunctional in ways that are harmful to the economy. It means that they have to dramatically increase their cash reserves to the point where they can't move money throughout the bank in order to stay afloat. It makes them ramp up interest rates on people's home loans, it makes them lower interest rates on people's savings. Noting this debate is not just about the total amount of risk, but where that risk is held. They say it's good for banks to moderate which kinds of asset classes they sell. This is actually bad for 3 reasons. Number one, sophisticated asset classes enable investors to expose themselves to more different kinds of risk, which enables them to hedge risk better. Secondly, they gain more information about risk in the economy by exposing themselves to isolated sources of risk. And thirdly, it improves the allocative efficiency of the market by enabling investors to more accurately identify which kinds of risks they want to expose themselves into. This is a clear affirmative.
2, 1. 3 things in this speech. Firstly, on who is likely going to be the largest stakeholder in this debate, and secondly, on why do we get more investment in innovation, and thirdly, in terms of risk management. Firstly, in terms of who is the main stakeholder here, I think their contention was you're likely going to be quite sophisticated investing into this. They give you 2 reasons why this is likely going to be true. But first response here was I think the reason why people are likely going to be quite having a high bar but not likely going to know so much about industry is because number one, there's quite good returns in terms of security versus all the other kinds of investment you can get in. This means that people are likely going to having an incentive to earning more money compared to purchasing other kinds of financial products in the comparison. But secondly, I also think banks in general has more incentive to try to attract more consumers in general, right? Because I don't think this is necessarily going to be one over the other, but likely going to be quite parallel under both sides, which means that you're likely going to have both stakeholders existing, and that means the stakeholder likely going to obtain all the harms versus maybe some kinds of small benefits to a lot of sophisticated investor under your side. But thirdly, I also think in terms of they say the barrier is quite high, that's the reason why this is driven people away. No, number one, even if the barrier is high, but I think there are many ways for you to attract a consumer in the first place. For example, the ads sending all by banks, which means that people are likely going to directly see the benefit of it rather than assessing the risk in general. But secondly, I also think in terms of people aren't likely going to fall into a certain kind of psychology, which is you don't actually know too much about this area, but you thought you actually know a lot in that. That's the reason why people are generally likely going to do that investment in terms of doing stocks. That because people thought they actually can manipulate the price of stock versus they actually don't, which means that people generally don't actually know what they don't know, and that's the reason why they're likely going to fall into this trap existing in our side. But thirdly, I also think in terms they say this is likely going to have all the other kinds of reserve investment. I think reserve investment is probably likely going to exist under both sides. But then the problem with this is banks has way much more money to get rid of it, which means that they have we have more control of banks' action in our side. Cool. Let's then talk about reset, get better innovations and investment. The first thing I want to respond here is the turn of their argument. I think people are likely going to invest into those innovations and are more likely going to invest into this. It's because number one, there's increasing public confidence in general. But secondly, I also think a lot of investment they claim for the only example coming from first app is there's global green energy is quite meaningful, but there is long time for you to get returns. But firstly, I think in general people are likely going to expect there is going to be large returns. But even if it is longer, there's still incentive for banks and also to issue the security and people to purchasing it in the first place. But that I think the structural reason why this is true is because first it's just factually true global warming is getting more and more severe, which means that people are likely going to feel the impact of this, and that's the reason people are likely going to invest into this. That looks like a lot of oil companies are directly purchasing the securities under that. But secondly, I also think the reason why it's not mutually exclusive is because people are likely going to realize this. So even if their harm don't exist, they only exist in the short term versus in the long term perspective, people can see the impact, and that's the reason why they're likely going to continue those investment. But thirdly, I think they're likely going to do better investment, because I think the thing is just if investment or like the innovation they are trying to propose under their side, it looks like global warming and green energy. Obviously, this is going to be a worthy investment, and this means like those investments more likely going to get prioritized on our side because banks see this as like less risky compared to other kinds of like, for example, like innovation or like technology industry that you're not actually really clear about what is going to be the return, which means that you got more investment on like good social issues, and that's the reason why you have more, propaganda or like posters related to that to make people informed of those investments. Cool. The third thing that let's do here was just like a mitigation to your argument, because I think the main reason behind this argument is that there's going to be increasing interest rate, and that drives people away, and that's the reason why this reduces innovation, and that is bad. The first thing I want to point out here is just like it seems like quite counterintuitive. Like if you increase the interest rate and that drives away consumers, then why would you increase the interest rate in the first place? And then their explanation was like you're likely going to make more money. That's the reason why you want to increase the interest rate. I think the first reason here was just like there are many other alternatives banks can try to earn money rather comparing to just directly increasing interest rate in general. That looks at, for example, you can issue more like safer securities, and then like also at the same time there's more public confidence, and this means that there's going to be more consumers like people who previously don't know that much about like financial market, but now they feel like the bank is sharing the same risk versus like bank doesn't really share the same risk in the past, and that's the reason why those people are like likely going to be new stakeholders who enter into this market, and that's the reason why you're likely going to make money rather than like directly just increase interest rate and drive away a lot of like consumers who were purchasing your security in the past. Cool. Lastly, let's then talk about risk management. I think they try to weigh this argument by saying that like risk management in the status quo is okay. That's the reason why it should be deprioritized in this debate. We contend this by saying that no, we don't think risk management is okay in the status quo. The first thing here is just like I think like banks are likely going to just like doing things like scamming people, or like there's going to be high returns, and then like attracting people. And their response is like but then this also did like reduce the reputation of the bank. That's the reason why a bank won't do this. I think there are several structural reasons why like you should prefer our mechanism. The first thing here is just like it doesn't really cause a huge damage on reputation of the banks in general, because like if this is like for example like my friend or like my mom purchasing a security and the security failed, obviously this information that doesn't get widespread in general, it doesn't really defeat the the whole reputation of the bank, which means that there is an information asymmetry exists in the status quo, which means that a lot of consumers doesn't actually know there is like a risk, like large risks attached with those securities, and that's the reason why like banks can get rid of that and issue security that is quite risky. But secondly, I also think in terms like there is a large barrier for people to enter into this market in terms like people are like likely going to like read through like 50 pages documents, and then like there are like a lot of niche knowledge. I think the thing here is just like they rely on the capitalization that you are already being quite sophisticated for you to find out like the flaws in terms like all those like terms and conditions. Versus in our side, you as an average individual, you just don't have the capacity to identify all those things, and that's exactly the reason why those people who are most vulnerable likely going to get the harm that we push to you. Let's then weigh this argument compared to their argument, right? I think that like if the trade-off in this debate is necessarily going to be there's going to be less security and less money like providing to poor people. The first thing I want to question here is just like number one, this relies on there's going to be increasing interest rate, which we defeated on like saying no, this is not likely going to be a comparative. But even if this is true, like I also find to think like banks in the status quo have the incentive to issue like a lot of securities not related to poor people because they don't actually see this as profitable in the status quo. So it's just really unclear on like how many people are likely going to get those benefits in the comparative, versus it's quite clear that a lot of people who are being lured into this investment are likely going to get harmed when they put like a lot of the like asset into the securities. But lastly, I also want to contend they're likely going to put quite a large sum of money into the security in general. Firstly, it's because there is like a bar of like you to purchasing security. You can't just spending like 1,000 like $100. You probably need to spend $1,000 in general. But secondly, there's like a lot of terms and conditions that you can't withdraw in the middle, which means that you're likely going to suffer at a time when you actually need the money most, and you're losing those like money in the middle. For all those reasons, so probably.
Can you tissue something?
It's okay, I don't remember. Huh? No, it's fine, I just feel bad. It's okay, I'm not pissed. I got away with it. Okay, sorry. Stop. Two parts to the speech, firstly on lenders and then on borrowers. On lenders, the first observation I want to make is that Negative's case is contingent on an explanation that these sets of investors, which I've titled lenders, who are exposed to risk are mom and dad investors in retail funds who are very sympathetic and who we should care about. This is their only mechanism with respect to all of their stuff about wealth creation, all of their stuff about contagion. If you do not believe that these are the sets of investors who are exposed to risk, you must conclude that the sets of investors who are exposed to risk are the types of people we talk to you about, the people who have the most capacity to deal with that risk, the people who are most likely to consent to it. Negative's claims about why it is likely that these sets of people who are most exposed to risk are, they just don't make sense. I don't. The first thing they tell us is that, well, the dominance of retail investment in the general market must mean that there is a dominance of retail investment in this specific market for securities. This does not make sense to me because, first of all, why? Obviously people would invest in different parts of the market. They need to actually prove it. Secondly, they just never at any point provide a reason why it's likely that these kind of mom and dad investors are as risk tolerant as they say. They constantly assert throughout their case that these people just chase maximum returns, that because there's maximum returns, people just, necessarily go for securities. But I think this is actually a group of people who are quite risk intolerant for the reasons that they themselves supply. Why would you, as someone with quite a modest income, chase risk? I think that this is the set of people who just think about the investors they're probably investing in pretty straightforward kind of bonds. They probably are not big securities heads. I think that this just is not a super intuitive characterization of these sets of people, and it's certainly an unproven one. But I guess you should also just ask yourself, why is this set of securities marketed to these investors? These are the people who are most likely to be confused about what these actually constitute. These are the people who are most likely to find other forms of investment far more appealing because the marketing knows simply that this is not risky, you're not going to lose all your money, you're not going to get GFC. So I do not think that they sufficiently prove this in the first instance. The next claim is to say, retail investors, which I think they seem to mean banks here, they're ordinary people invest in banks, and banks are the ones who create these, which means ordinary people must be exposed to the risk. But they then sell the securities to someone else. So this does not make sense. Why would creating the risk mean that you're exposed to the risk? This in fact seems concessionary because banks are more exposed to this risk on their side of the house because banks are retaining some of the risk. So this I think makes totally no sense. Which means, I think so far in this debate, there's not really a clear reason to believe that ordinary people are just out here investing in securities all over the place. I think we provide much more coherent reasons to believe that there's largely institutional investors with the institutional capability, with finance degrees to show for it, to understand what securities are and to invest in them. Our claim then is, it is good that institutional investors can access these securities because they have the capacity, both in terms of capital and in terms of expertise, to hedge against this risk by investing in other forms of things, by investing in things like bonds, which means that this specifically increases returns in general. The capacity for institutional investors who are investing on behalf of people who have a huge amount of expertise, who invest in high-risk assets or high-risk securities, is something which is good because it allows them to increase their returns for ordinary mom and dad people. So those sets of people are richer on our side because you give the people with the expertise to make money the capacity to fully make money, the capacity to, take wise risk, to be honest, in some instances, and get returns for it. In order to get over that claim, which is just sets of people they seem to care about a lot are richer on our side of the house, you would have to believe the idea that institutional investors and banks cannot do their job and that they're likely to do this in risky ways. One observation I want to make before I get into this in more detail is just that I think side negative conflates two risks in this debate. There are two sets of risks we might care about in this debate. Firstly, there is the default risk on the underlying asset, so people's inability to pay back their mortgage. But secondly, there is the risk to the value of the combined or packaged security. And all of their responses to our claims about the first thing, which is to say the kind of risk that most people are immediately exposed to, their mortgage, the lending behavior of banks, are just responses to the second thing. They're well, these are still risky assets. Yes, but they're risky because of the aggregate. They're not risky, that doesn't mean that banks do more risky lending. They did not individually prove this. So that's the first observation I would make. But again, I just think we give a series of reasons why financial institutions tend to do a good job and tend not to be literally insane risk mongers. Firstly, we explain that the kind of moral hazard arguments they make just aren't real. As an investment banker, your career is legit over if you cause a financial crash. You have enormous personal and professional incentives to do good at your job. Secondly, we explain that there's an enormous amount of scrutiny post-GFC. Thirdly, we explain that there's competition between different financial institutions, which holds institutions accountable. But fourthly, we explain down the bench that there is a higher capacity for these kinds of institutions to hedge against risk. So even if their risk appetite is a bit high, I think they are likely able to respond to it and deal with it sensibly. Their main response to that is just to say that banks and financial institutions have a lot of political power. This is already defeated responsibly at Charlie, who explains that clearly if politics has done this already, then they know how to regulate banks and financial institutions. But this is also just unresponsive to the endogenous sets of incentives we give you as to why financial institutions want to make good choices independent of government regulation. I think it is insufficient. Finally, we provide some cool ways to believe that this worsens results for investors, kind of separate to the risk question. I.e., we explain that this form of financial product is good, we want more of them, and that forcing banks to retain some of that high risk is a bad thing. Like, the question you should ask yourself at the end of the debate is, would it be good if banks had to hold more high risk assets, which is essentially what they want them to do, to hold on to a bit for each, like, one that they sell. And we give you a series of reasons why it would be clearly bad. We tell you that this increases risks on banks rather than large-scale investors, and it's bad because banks are more integrated in the financial system. They are the nexus point by which most people tend to interact with the financial system. We explain that this changes bank calculus in other ways. They try to hedge against the risk they create by having to maintain or hold on these securities, on these assets, by, for instance, raising interest rates for other asset classes, or by being less willing to borrow. We explain that it is important that banks are doing well in financial crises, and if it's the case that this is exposed to financial risk, this means banks get poorer in financial crises when this asset class decreases in value, which is really bad because it means it's more costly for central banks to bail them out. It means also that they have to have more, like, their reserve requirements go up because this reduces the value of their holdings, which is obviously more costly for your average bank consumer. But finally, we explain that banks issuing a lot of securities is a good thing. High liquidity securities markets are better because they provide people with more information and more mobility. It means people don't sell their securities straight away because they're stressed that no one will buy it if they don't sell it right now. They increase volatility, not us. All of this explains comprehensively that for investors, it is bad that banks retain some of these risks. It's bad because it exposes banks to these risks. It's bad because it means the institutional investors make more money, and their claim about retail investors straightforwardly does not make sense and was not proven. Finally, I want to talk about borrowers, which is where I think Affirmative really runs away with this debate. We explained to you that this structurally makes banks more conservative because they're holding on to a bunch of risks. They push us for a mech, we provided it at first. The mechanism is when banks have to hold on to the risks of lending, by, like, they package the security, which is a bunch of loans to people, and they have to hold some of that risk. When they're having to hold on to that risk, they are less likely to lend as much. They are more conservative about that. It is higher risk for them. And they really just mitigate this. They try to say, well, there's incentives for innovations on both sides, and there's some practical quibbles about the interest rate. No, our mechanism straightforwardly makes sense. And their claim that investors expect risk just doesn't work, because the point is borrowing gets more costly. Not every company is public. There are lots of innovators who borrow from banks, and crucially, we expand the pool of investment by making people more positive about the economy, by making people wealthier. I just want to quickly weigh risk against growth, because we would make the trade-off that if this slightly increased financial risk, but it made people richer, we would prefer that for a few reasons. One, we explained that risk accrues most to the specific people who have consented to it and who are mostly kind of sectioned off from the rest of the economy and who mostly have the capacity to deal with it, whereas growth appeals across the economy because of the circular flow of income. People make more money when businesses are able to do things like innovate, when growth goes up overall, but also risk is just less likely, but also like growth is cumulative. The more the economy grows, less risk is a problem because people have the wealth to absorb it. That's both the kind of institutional investors we talk about it, but even at their best case, it's ordinary people. So proud of them.
Firstly on risk and then on reward. The first question I want to answer is probably the biggest challenge thrown out to us by Affirmative, which is who invests in these. Because they tell us that the largest investors are institutional investors who can afford to pass the complexity. The first thing I would observe here is that this is just a mitigatory response, and there are a set of mum and dad investors who go and they broker at local banks. They rely on the trusted information that they get from these banks. Now, I'm happy to concede that that is a relatively smaller part of this debate, but I want to look very closely at exactly who the institutional investors who invest in these sort of products are, because they are not just massive groups who can tolerate this risk infinitely. And the reason for that is, even though they are reasonably good at calculating risk, what a lot of these firms rely on, particularly in this debate when they are buying securities on the retail market and not creating their own, is because they are hedge funds, because they are consumer funds who are reliant on consumers paying them. They are things like pension funds that get brought up at 2A. Why is that particularly important in this debate? It's because there is a an inconvenient incentive misalignment here, which is that these funds, because it is incredibly difficult to outperform the market year on year, want to take higher risks so that they can appeal to more people. Because they take a fee off the top, you want more people investing in your fund, you want more mum and dad investors coming to your pension fund because you advertise a higher rate of return. The consequence of that is you have an incentive to take on more risk than the average mom and pop investor would probably want, and they don't know because they just trust that pension funds work all the time. But very few of them actually outpace the market on average. No fund over a 20-year period has beaten the market year on year. Note that the consequence of that is that you have a much higher risk tolerance. What we do on side negative uniquely when we have risk retention is that we align the incentives of banks in the first place when packaging these securities to reduce the risk. That means that the securities that these investment firms bought into were necessarily lower risk, even though they wanted to take on higher risk investments. Even though they may have been able to calculate it, we reduce the risk for the average person. We reduce the probability that people opened their pension fund one day and found that it was half of what they were expecting to retire on. Note that this was the most vulnerable group in this debate, and even if they came through the overall investment channel, like a Vanguard or something like that, they were still the ones who copped the risk. They were still the ones who copped the end harm when these products failed. We were perfectly happy for banks to try and reduce that risk in the first place. What they tell us next is these retail investors are just unlikely independently of that. So, the next thing they tell us is, well, this only happens for investors who can't make it themselves. I think that's probably true, because a lot of investors can't make it themselves, but I've just observed that many large firms like Vanguard do. So necessarily the remainder of these firms who engage in these transactions are the less powerful ones, the ones who can't afford to engage in these themselves. That would make you believe necessarily then that they have less comparative power when negotiating with banks, that they have less capacity to get a good deal, get a lower risk, higher reward deal from the bank. These do continue to favor the banks. They do not have the structural power, which is asserted to you that they have on-side Affirmative. So, how then does this affect risk and regulation? They tell us then, we tell you that risk is particularly complicated, and they tell you that you don't want risk to be complicated because it's a deterrent to purchasing. Note that this is not about having always the investment groups interact with them. We tell you that it's particularly hard for governments to regulate these in effective ways that said to no response. And what is particularly important here is because it is easier to be mischievous with your regulatory reporting than it is with another investor, because these groups like SEC, ASIC are overburdened with all these misreporting and financial regulations. It is much more complex to them. They have less of a stake in it than those investment groups. So that risk, it was easier to hide that risk from the government, and I'll explain why this is a particularly potent weapon for the government in a second. But next they tell you that these firms just have similar structural power to banks, so it doesn't matter. Firstly, I've explained why in a lot of cases they don't have a similar structural power to banks, because if you did, you would probably be packaging these yourselves, because it is possible to create your own financial instruments in that way. But secondly, if it is true, and you believe side Affirmative that they do have a similar structural power to banks, then it increases the extent to which you would want them to be risk averse, because the more structural power they have, the more ingrained they are in the economy, the higher the probability that something goes, the higher the risk that when something goes wrong, it goes really badly wrong. So, where they did have a similar structural power to banks, we wanted them to be investing in less risky things. We explained to you a very simple mechanism that banks package these securities less riskily when they have to own a portion of them. So, is the systemic risk actually as low as side Affirmative believes? And I tell you that it is because there's an incentive to look good and to manage these well, because as an investment bank, your career is over. Obviously, this is true to an extent, but I think it is just fairly intuitive OIV knowledge that banks are not always good faith actors, and they do have profit incentives. They do have people who, every person who wants to, is afraid that their career will end if they trigger the GFC. Obviously, most people's careers don't end because they trigger the GFC, but there is an incentive to improve your career, to accelerate, to be the one on your floor who makes the most money, who gets the most surplus value for your firm. Note that there is an incentive misalignment there, where you want to do this particularly well, so you do take higher risks. And I think even though you want to regulate in a reasonable way, you do sometimes take these increased risks as investment bankers. That is just true. They couldn't say it never happened. But the next thing they say is that GFC still looms large. So it's important to consider that everyone is really worried about risk because of the GFC. Firstly, as they note at first Affirmative, this is a GFC era policy. This is the sort of thing that created that fear in the first place. This is why banks are afraid of regulation. This is why banks engage in practices in a particularly better way if they do. The next thing they tell you is the next thing we tell you, this just doesn't engage with the structural power of banks. It is incredibly difficult to regulate banks because economies are reliant on them. You cannot, the banks can have governments by the balls because of how powerful those banks are. Note that what this does very importantly is it makes regulation simpler by giving you a reasonably low political capital solution. Because you say, yes, banks, you can actually profit from this. You can have securities which are likely to go up in value, and if you do your job well, we don't have to regulate you in any increased fashion. Note that that is a really easy risk mitigation solution that you can include. It's reasonably popular amongst conservatives. I would note that in places like the US where regulation is particularly tough because of things like the Republican House, you are able to pass regulations like this much more effectively because they align with incentives about the free market being good and the market being successful on net. As a consequence of that, it is unclear that in the comparative world you ever had a regulation tool which was effective that could be passed and it was as resistant to change. Note then, at the end of this, there isn't just a risk to your retail investors who do exist in this debate. It was unclear that there was a comparatively easy way to prevent this risk. We tell you that it is a reasonably small harm for those banks to cop, they are able to cop. So then, that's on risk. What about reward and the access to loans? Because they tell you on side Affirmative down the bench that you pass the risk on to the consumers. Obviously there is capacity to pass the risk on to the consumers, but what they never give you in response to the material 7 gives you at one end is why. Because obviously you sometimes have to do this when there is a limited cash reserve. But as we explained, cash reserves are reasonably large at the moment. They are increasingly large because banks are making record profits and they are banking that. What we would observe here is obviously then they have the capacity to profit enormously from loans. There is an incentive to make loans accessible to as large a range of people as possible, because charging 3% interest on loans to a much larger group of people is better than charging 4.5% interest on loans to a much smaller group of people. So you want to make loans as accessible as possible, because that's how you engage business in your bank, that's how you get it. So it's incredibly unclear that this risk was ever passed on to the consumers in the world right now. But what we explained to you, sort of to flip this even further, is that when this security packaging is successful, what you actually have is a larger asset pool from which you can pass out credit. What you have is an ability to actually increase the number of loans that you can provide when these are successful. So then on the access to loans, you continue to want to give out loans because they are profitable. There's a fundamentally different underlying risk of the security and the loan, which we explained to you and said. And noting that innovation is tolerant of risk anyway, you are actually able to get a larger pool of credit available, which reduce the need for your high interest rates, which unlock the benefit that Stephenson wanted to claim for small business investors. We help them, we reduce systemic risk as a whole. We were so proud to get.
I'm going to start by explaining the benefit that we give you on systemic risk, because I think this is the quickest way that we win this debate that this affirmative team doesn't really engage with. I constructively explain it first, that there is an incentive for banks to diversify away from a particular set of funds and go to often medium range funds, because obviously there are a set of risks that were associated with doing this. But secondly, banks don't want to deal with the intolerable risks of high risk firms engaging in these securities. They don't want to buy this, so they don't create the offers for those securities and the market for those securities, which means we ameliorate the concern there. But thirdly, we explain that banks don't like risk so that they don't engage in this behavior in the first place. Okay, this receives a few responses, but essentially the only response that we get is to explain that banks take on this risk and that is quite bad. But I think we directly flip this and explain why that's quite a good thing. Firstly, because it was less likely to create those securities, which means that the banks never took on those risks because they were intolerant of those risks in the first place. But secondly, I explain to no response, and what gets whipped at Xavier is that obviously the way in which we directly flip this affirmative material is if those underlying securities are quite good, if the securities are quite good, then the fact that we are retaining and engaging those securities means that we have profit to offset that, which means we get the benefit of this team in any case. Obviously then, it meant that we engaged in less systemic risk, but to the extent that they did engage in that kind of risk on our side, it meant that we got the benefits of that, but were able to curb the worst outcomes, which I think directly flips all of these affirmative claims on this. Obviously, the way that it gives you is this systematic risk, literally applies to everyone. It applies to the entire economy. Ellie wanted to explain to you that, growth was more important because the secular flow, the 5-sector flow model applies to everyone. But obviously, like the cost of living, the things like that happen when an entire economy crashes applies to everyone as well. You should probably care about that as well. Notice the harm is so much worse of an economic crisis impacting out the poorest people than it is the benefits accruing to like the rich investors of these people who get to claim the benefit, even if that was going to proliferate through the 5-sector flow model. Now onto consumers. Oscar explains that you decrease access to credit, but I don't think this is properly mechanized. We explain to you firstly why this is untrue. We mitigate this in 2 ways. We firstly explain that there are a lot of reserves that you have, which means that there's still a lot of money that you can hand out to people. It's unclear because this team never points to scale why there aren't billions of dollars above reserves, as I explained structurally, because banks could still hand out and borrow. But secondly, that empirically borrowing is just higher than pre-GFC levels. If there is an empirical tension that this team doesn't engage with, which is the fact that banks are lending more than they did pre-GFC, despite this regulation that they say is so bad. But beyond this mitigation, we directly fit this by explaining that the purchase of these underlying assets allow them to leverage themselves more and offer more credit to people. That directly undercuts their claim. It means that, to the extent that you cared about these green firms and them accessing credit, you were able to do that far better on our side, because you were able to do things like leverage the underlying assets that you purchased, as I explained, leverage the securities themselves, which meant that you could lend more to these people at lower interest rates. I think that directly flipped all of the material about consumers. Finally, on the moral hazard and all of the direct stuff about consumers, we explain that the kind of people that purchase this are consumers at large. Even if we buy their mitigation, this is just mitigation. It is still a lot of people who are engaging on this on the consumer level. But the thing that this flies in the face of that we explain is that obviously the people that institutional investors are using the money of to invest in are mum and dad. To the extent that they are engaging in intolerable risk, the people who cop that are the mum and dads who don't read the PDS and risk disclosures of those institutional investors. These are the kind of people that Xavier explains wake up and find out that there's 75% of their pension there was yesterday. Obviously that is a huge harm. These are people who rely on this money for their retirement. This is a large set of people, the most vulnerable people in the debate. But we explain uncontingently why banks engage in bad faith. We align their incentives in a way that was far more likely to be good, that hedges against the worst risks. That means that banks, because they were taking on these risks, were unwilling to engage in it and fuck over these people.
Look, this debate is deceptively technical. The anatomy of this debate basically goes like this. You have a bank that wants to sell a complicated financial instrument, a security that derives its value from the value of a real thing, a loan, and a bundle of loans, or a bundle of bonds. The government decides, well, if you're going to sell that, you need to partake in the risk to the people that you are selling it to by generating that asset. What you need to do is hold some of them. Because the risk of that is, it could decrease radically in value, and those people could be financially harmed by that asset being risky. That'll make you more risk, averse about, and more prudent about the risk you're generating to the market more broadly. The bank's response to that is to say, all right, well, we'll do that. We'll lend to fewer people, we'll lend to them with higher rates, because we want to make the underlying security that we're giving out less risky, so it's less risky for us, less risky for the people that are buying that security, so we're going to make that asset less risky. Which sets the question of this debate up as this. Is this a bargain that is worth the cost? And our answer from the beginning was no. And I think at no point did the negative team in this debate successfully make a compelling case for what they are really arguing, which is, do people who buy complex financial derivatives deserve any and all protection from the financial risk that they are partaking in at the expense of real people who have home loans, having higher interest rates, and having less access to capital? And I just do not think that they get that. Let's deal with systemic risk, which is clearly negative as part of the trade-off. At the beginning of this debate, we throw a whole lot of cold water on the idea that systemic risk is something that you should really give much credence to. The GFC clearly bears on this debate and the kind of financial risk that complex financial assets can bring to the financial market. They say, well, there's been other financial crises, but these are different in character. The one that happened that Seb obtusely references in First Negative is one where banks held government bonds. That wasn't one where they were trading complex financial derivatives. It was caused fundamentally by inflation. And so it's not something that this kind of policy really could regulate out. Their claim is that systemic risk is something that's so concerning because banks are subject to the inability to be really regulated. Which is interesting, because later in that analysis, probably 10 seconds later, they say, well, of course the SEC would enforce the regulations that they support very well. And this debate has considered that the Dodd-Frank regulations, which were implemented after the GFC on a bunch of too big to fail banks, actually got enforced. The anatomy of our claim is just, of course, it's often politically unpalatable to regulate banks that are too big to fail, but when they engage in really speculative and risky behavior, there is that appetite. Those regulations do exist, which explains why it is the case that banks are fearful of those regulations, which detriment their ability to operate and so do preemptively act in ways that are acceptable. There are other and most bizarre claims about retail investors. This negative team is so unintuitive. They require you to believe that banks have incentives to sell ailing geriatrics, complex financial instruments, rather than a managed fund and a pension fund to have, to have their risk bundled into, and instead to have, rather than 50% of pensioners' nest eggs being in high-risk financial products. I know it's cool to hate on banks in debating, but you have to ask whether these incentives are more reasonable than financial institutions strategically taking on risk to increase their returns. I think what we do instead is we portray a set of boutique risks that are created when you force banks to hold many more high-risk assets. It makes them a lot riskier, harder for them when they hold a bunch of high-risk assets, as this negative team forces them to do, to discharge the role they relevantly hold in solving a broader financial crisis. And it makes security markets very illiquid because there's less of the security now because you sell less of them because they're risky, which means it's harder to allocate value to things that are of value because it's hard to buy and sell, it's hard to accurately assess the price of a security. I think we provide ample weighing for the reasons you should care about credit. And they just can't refute the mechanism because it's inherent to the way that they are resolving risk, which is they want to resolve risk, they have to make banks do less risky behavior, which means give people less credit. We weigh this extensively, wrote about it.
Okay, hi everyone, thank you all very much for that debate. Sorry the deliberation took a little while. I guess it was obviously a very dense debate, very intense economics debate, and we had a bit of a discussion afterwards as a panel. So I guess that's just on you guys having such a close debate that took a while. We'll do some general feedback, we'll go through the result and the reasons for the result. A couple of general feedback. I think this part varied at times in the debate, but obviously it is quite a heavy economics motion. I think both things could work on dumbing it down a little bit, of just like being really clear about what are we actually talking about, what do these terms mean, what do they mean for the world, and especially that latter part of like, what is the consequence and let's ground it in something real that I think will help judges, myself included at times, who are a bit economically illiterate as to what this debate actually is doing and what a lot of these terms mean, because that, I think over the course of the debate becomes clearer and better. I think it would have been useful just to make it more easy to understand, but any sort of complex debate I think it is useful. I think secondly, it is at times like there's a lot thrown around about who's investing where and who's investing in what, but like just saying these bodies doesn't mean much if they're doing that. I think describing the bodies a bit more, why they matter, what they're useful for, and make sure that you're being as clear as possible, so not as vague as like, oh, this body or that group. Because then it's like, we've already talked about 4 groups in this speech, which I'm referring to at this point. I think making sure it's all nailed down a bit clearly can be quite useful. I think the third thing was just trying to like maybe engage a bit more of the, even if it is what the other team says it is doing this, why is that still beneficial for our side in case the judge doesn't buy it or characterization. In terms of the result then, it wasn't quite a good debate, and I think quite a very close debate between the teams. We ultimately had a unanimous decision and gave the debate decided affirmative. Congratulations. There were broadly 3 questions. The first one I want to talk about is just this question of who is the most person in the debate doing all the trading and all the investing, etc. Because I think we get, I guess the first biggest push about who it is comes from Neg, the idea that it's retail investors, it's mum and dad investors that are engaging in this because they're a large group, they're active in the market, and they're the ones who are looking to put a little bit of their savings away to try and make some income, and these things do have good returns, security bonds, etc. I think what AF is able to do is push back as to why it is really unlikely that the majority of these investments are likely to come from this group for a number of reasons. One, they're quite complex, they're difficult to understand, which on a knowledge level rules out a bunch of people participating in them. Secondly, they're just like not the target market because of the amount of capital complexity, etc. involved. Thirdly, there's alternatives for these people to invest in that mean that they're not pushed into this one. They do have simpler places to go instead, but also the access to capital that's required to invest in these, what presumably for the debate quite expensive things to buy into, is more likely to rule that group out. I think on an individual level, those groups are probably not the ones we're talking about. I did like the response from Neg that comes out, well, even if it's not these people directly, it is them through a proxy. So it's them through hedge funds or pension funds, etc. So even if there's a body in between, there's still a level of risk that applies to these people. So the same reason we should care about them applies if there's a body in the middle there. I think that level of removal, while still connects to them, I think does present a pretty big barrier to the risk opposed to them, which means that then when we compare to second issues around levels of risk, etc., we're not necessarily comparing this group, but comparing the hedge funds, pension funds, etc., which is where I think more of affirmative material on bigger institutions comes into play and resists that. So I think at this point in the debate, we're willing to believe it's likely to be more what affirmative thinks are the ones investing in these models, in these securities. So, second issue, risk of risk. Do we need these extra things to protect us against things going badly again? So I guess the question here is how much of this GFC, Frank Dodd-era stuff do we still need, and is this particular one very, very useful? So Affirmative gives us a bunch of reasons why they think that this is unlikely to be as necessary now, and we'll get to the hindrances that it causes later on. That being one, that on an individual level, people do not want to take on this risk, cause a second GFC, be responsible for it, you can't work again. So lots of people managing funds or doing investment want to avoid this overall, so there are incentives, I guess there. Secondly, there's more awareness and risk across the whole market about how bad these things could go, particularly around securities, given the centrality of that to the GFC. These people are more aware of the consequences, so less likely to do silly things. But also they're wary of more regulation, so they don't want to risk doing things or acting in ways that makes the government get more involved with them. There's then some responses here from negative. There's a bit of a fight back about how much regulations and power banks have to be regulated or not to be regulated. I think given both teams are able to point to examples where there has been regulation applied to these banks, I'm willing to believe that there's capacity to apply regulations, and I'm willing to believe in both things that be an unwillingness from banks to want to have significant amounts of regulation. Even if neg's able to somewhat limit it because banks have a degree of power and uniqueness of role in the organisation, I think the fact that both teams have talked about regulations are applied, we can apply regulation. So I think that fear works. Extra response we get from neg then is, well, financial crisis still happened. It's pointed out by Aff, those are different causes in those cases. But also the other response we get is these are laws from this era of the GFC experience, so that they are removing it as actually in the wrong signal because it's a law we need to keep. We're not adding extra laws. But I think the idea from Aff is that even if this is removed, banks still don't want other regulations or this rule or other things to come back in. So I still think the fear of disincentive mechanism works as to why these risk levers are still needed. The next response we get from neg is that banks are still a bit unscrupulous. There's still a push for bankers to try and be the most successful person, to try and push to have the highest returns, be the most successful trader on the floor, etc. While I think that is probably true to some extent, people who are pushing that, I think the overall system pushes against the organisations to allow this probably still stand. So maybe an individual banker wants to get away with that. Do I think that the bank or the institution will let them or want them to get away with that? I think more willing to believe from there to be enough pressure to prevent those worst excesses then. So I think given all that level of risk stuff then, I think then the bigger funds are probably have all those internal built risk mechanisms to not want to engage in this in a way that is so risky that having this reserve risk thing actually provides a huge amount of benefit, because it's not preventing there are other things to prevent what that benefit would need it for. And I think that has some benefits. So having a high liquidity securities market is good. People are more likely to be able to have confidence to hold onto them because they can sell them more quickly, which is kind of counterintuitive. It's high liquid, but you don't sell because of that anyway. But because of that market is actually a bit stronger now as a consequence of that. So I think that means that the risk mechanisms probably aren't as required anymore. Given that then, the third question is about just what happens to the access to credit now, which is Aff's big benefit. So now we remove this, we get this benefit here that exists. Does that stack up against the risk, the level of risk we just talked about? So Affirmative tells us that the easiest way now with this law in place is to reduce risk, is to just increase interest rates. So offer to less people, higher rates to those you do offer to, so that what risk pool you have to maintain is a lower risk, because you can't just sell that risk off to someone else, so banks become less risk, more risk averse and less willing to engage in risks. I think the problem here I have with the debate is that the majority of the responses that come from neg are ones about, I guess, factual observations about how they think the banking system has worked, about whether or not there are huge amounts of capital reserves that already exist in banks that don't need to engage in this, or whether or not interest rates have been higher anyway, or the claim that there's just been massively increased amount of borrowing post GFC, which all I guess try to suggest that this is not how banks are likely to operate. I guess the first thing that why we still give it to AF on this is one, I think they talk about incentives about why banks still, even if they do have those massive cash reserves, still want to make more money and still want to hedge against as much risk as they can. This is an easy way to pass that cost on and hedge against the risk. But two, I think like even if we believed, and there's a lot of OIV thrown around, but even if we do believe that to some extent this is occurring in some banks or in some cases, it's not proven to me that this exists across the board. I think AF does enough to explain logically why this is the most likely response that banks are likely to have. You remove this extra burden on them, they are more likely to pass on the cost, because now the way they make that profit back is by selling those securities off in balance with that risk stuff we talked about in the second issue. So I think they actually get the achievement they want on the credit issue. I hope that all made sense. There was obviously a lot in this debate. I've tried just to still the away to the stuff that actually makes the most determinative sense in how the decision was made. But if teams have questions or anything like that,